thank you for having us. We're going to talk about cities. I feel I live and breathe cities. Just maybe a few words to myself. I said I'm running the organization, but I'm also running now the first UN Excellence Center for Smart Sustainable Cities. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit what we do in this center and how the United Nations is working on tackling city issue at the moment. We have set up a program called United Smart City. And what we did there, because we've discussed already a little bit before today, is that we approached, together with United Nations, 6 cities and said, this is 5 years ago. And we said, what do these cities really need? How can we help them as big international organization? Not that what we think they need, but they tell us what they really need. So for 6 years ago, in 2014, we got together, we selected 6 cities, and we started to look at, what is smart and what is sustainable. And I will never going to say anything about the definition what is smart and sustainable. But you have a lot of you driving into a lot of cities, and they say you're driving now into a smart city. And we wanted to say, is it smart and is it sustainable? And how can we do that? So what we've been busy doing for the last almost 5 years is that we have developed now a UN standard for smart sustainable city, a global standard that is applicable for any city on the planet. So I'm welcoming any city from America that is here today to join and test the city out and see how smart and sustainable is this. And we've been working on that on only one purpose. Of course, also to gather the data on cities, because we're just writing now an insight report on cities, and it's scary how little city data that is there, and how it could be used to compare cities and to find ways of getting to solutions. Because this is the only thing what matters, is that we get solutions going, that we get projects going. And are we in I have Richard next to me here, but we are absolutely not on track. After being around for a lot of years now, together with the United Nations in so many countries, so many cities, I think I've visited maybe 1,000 cities, we are absolutely not on track for 2030. And we can talk about as much as we want sustainable development goals, but we are far from where we need to be. And especially in terms of managing our resources. And I mean managing our water, managing our air, and managing our land management, land issues. We are not on track on that. And what we have seen through the UN and through these projects now, that there is 3 main areas that we are not on track on. And I'm sure Richard can share some of that afterwards, and I hope he agrees with me. And the one thing is especially with technology integration and the emerging technologies. And we have a technology for everything. All of these issues we have technologies for. But it's not integrated into the cities because it's complicated. It's technologies that you need a cross-sector approach. It's not silo approach anymore. It's complex issues. The whole administrations, the private sector, everybody needs to be at the table. This is complex issues. Sounds like a cliche that you need to build a bridge, but you need to do that. The second is the whole financing issue. You heard it many times here today. How we're going to do the bridge to finance all of these needs that is around in the world, right? How we're going to motivate the investment sector to work with us, the finance sector to work with us to finance a lot of the new models, new business models, new ways of financing the sustainable development in the future. And the third one is the citizen engagement. How are we going to get people to understand we need to change our behavior? And I applaud the Nigerian speaker who was here in the morning who said that we all have to do the right things, because that's what it's all about. And I think the cities are where we can really show that they can do the right things. We have tremendous city leadership around the world at the moment that we need to use for the purpose of showing it's possible. So with that, I just want to start to introduce the panel here. They will tell where they come from and what they do. I just want to say I have here on my left side, I have Richard Florida. Most of you probably know. And then we have here Alfred Berkeley. We have Valarie McCall from the city of Cleveland. And we had Ahmed Helal from the Institute of America in Qatar. So with that, I'm going to give over to you, Richard. Are we in a crisis, or how do you see this?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me 2 years in a row to this magnificent World Strategic Forum. Thanks to the International Economic Forum of the Americas for having us back at this wonderful hotel. It's always a pleasure to be with all of you. And by the way, for all the problems we have, congratulations in your work. I mean, I played a little role in the UN in making sure we got an SDG, a so-called Sustainable Development Goal for cities, and we did. And despite all the problems we face, that was a big deal. It is a big deal to have that goal as part of the UN framework. Part of me likes to say we live in the best of times and we live in the worst of times. Certainly looking at the leadership of nations, I'm not going to say in the United States, but in other nations around the world, you could say that there's been some dysfunction, polarization, the rise of populism, and not just here in the United States, on both the right and the left, but across the world, across Europe, across Latin America. But it's the best of time in cities, you know, and what keeps me going is the work I do not only in big global cities, but in little cities all over the United States and all over Canada, where I spend a good part of my time, and all over Latin America and in Europe. I was in your hometown of Ålesund, Norway, just this time last year. And what you see happening on the ground in the United States, we would say bipartisan, but elsewhere we would say in a way that brings together political and ideological differences, is incredible. So that's what I think we need to keep our eyes on, that really the excitement and energy being devoted to rebuilding and remaking and revitalizing cities is really the path forward. And I hope to God, actually, one of the things that I'm focused on is we can devolve power sooner or later away from these nation states and towards cities. Just briefly about technology in cities. You know, in my career, I've studied two things. I've studied the organization of high-tech industries and I've studied cities, and I never thought they would come together. In fact, for most of my career, high-tech industries were not in cities, they were in suburban office parks. But over the past 10 years, we've seen this powerful movement of the leading-edge high-technology industries in the world back to the urban cores of great cities. We just completed a study of global startups. Global startups, the Silicon Valley is no longer the leader. In fact, I think it barely makes the top 5. San Francisco, the city of San Francisco is first, New York is second, and then it's roughly London, Beijing, Shanghai, and other big cities like Berlin or Toronto are all amongst them, and Miami's among the top 25. The city has become the platform of innovation and the subject of innovation. We talk about smart cities, very important subject. But actually we quantified in this study what we call a field of urban tech. Urban tech includes smart cities, but the largest valuations in the history of venture capital are now all companies that work on city problems. Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, WeWork, ride-sharing, co-housing, co-working, modular construction. We go down the list. We were able to estimate for 2017, $44 billion, nearly $50 billion in venture capital investment, about a quarter of all venture capital investment, larger than artificial intelligence, larger than cryptocurrency. So the city itself is not only the platform of innovation, it's the subject of innovation. But here's what keeps me up at night. Even when I came here last year, I would have been much more optimistic about the capacity of our cities to garner this innovation and to propel and catalyze this innovation. But what's happened in the past year, partly as a result of this populist moment in our nations, from both left and right, is an incredible backlash, and I don't think we can sweep it under the table. I've seen it in my hometown of Toronto, where we have a very interesting project called Sidewalk Labs, an effort to try to build a demonstration project and a cluster, a fantastic project, but there's been a lot of nervousness about privacy and about big tech companies. We saw it a lot with the Amazon HQ2. Literally, after searching through 236 communities in North America and selecting 2, by the way, some of us predicted exactly which 2 they would select. I'm not going to say who that was. But after selecting 2, Northern Virginia, outside of Greater Washington, D.C., and Long Island City in New York, Amazon pulled the plug on one of its 2 selections because of the community concerns that Amazon was getting too many incentives and was extracting too much. So I think one of the very important challenges we face as city builders and city leaders is how do we create a context where technology and cities can go together and that we can cope with in the best way possible and mitigate this backlash so our cities can become the hotbeds and propellers and catalyzers of great new technologies.
Alfred.
Inside that construct, that model that was just laid out, I've been working on a couple of very specific things. A little bit of background, I had the privilege of serving as the president of the NASDAQ stock market, which, as you know, has been a source of capital for many startups and a very powerful job creation engine over the roughly 60 years it's existed. I also had the privilege of chairing for President Bush and President Obama, the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council. It started out mainly as cyber concerns, but President Bush expanded it to include other aspects of 18 industries. And lately I've been, actually there's one more thing I want to mention to you first. I chaired the Securities and Exchange Commission's effort to make the EDGAR database, the big database of company reports, machine readable. And it has relevance to this idea of how we integrate the data that's coming out of all the new technologies that are touching cities. With that work experience, I was asked by some officers and advisors to the United Nations to develop a NASDAQ 100-like index of companies around the world that are hewing to the Sustainable Development Goals. And this really interested me because, for several reasons, I think it's important that everybody in this room really understand how important it is that we make the Sustainable Development Goals movement work. It took enormous political courage on the part of the United Nations. Its brand was almost ruined by the failure of the Millennial Development Goals. The Millennial Development Goals were not that different, but the implementation approach was very different. Now, what do I mean by that? The implementation approach on the Millennial Development Goals saw governments making important changes over a 15-year period. And the experience said that that just wasn't going to happen. The world of politics is about or. You elect this person or that person. The world of economics is about and the co-growth, the compounding together of economic activity. So you had a situation in which the Millennial Development Goals were failing, and the UN still stepped up to the fact that the problems are so important that they couldn't let failure, which most organizations would have run from, they couldn't let failure dominate. They had to try again. And this time, it's all structured around public-private partnerships. It's really important for people, leaders in the room here, to understand that. And I would make a call to you to get behind this effort, because I think it is taking on legs that the Millennial Development Goals never could have, and for a variety of changed circumstances, has a possibility of working. I'm pretty cynical. You know, I spent 11 years working on the President's Infrastructure Advisory Council in the United States, and I really had a lesson in how hard it is, particularly in a democracy, to get change implemented. This ground-up initiative of the Sustainable Development Goals has the seeds of something that's actually going to work. It may not work across all 17 goals. It may not work across the 10 targets for each goal. But we can make tremendous progress as a human race if we just get half of those goals achieved, or even a third of those goals achieved. It'll make a huge difference. One of the tools that we've been working on is trying to find out how to get the word out on the importance of the goals and the fact that it might work. That if we get enough critical mass, enough of a tipping point, we will really get some good results. And there's a book out called The $1 Trillion Shift, which is put out by a Danish woman named Margaret Hoek, that is essentially a case study of about what 50 companies, or some of them are nonprofits, are doing on that she doesn't cover all 17 goals, but it's case studies about what companies are actually doing. And I'm mentioning it because it's a tool to give some documented in writing description for the narrative that we need that this can work. So that acceptance and taking a little personal risk by committing to the SDGs is an important part of this message. The other part that I think is important is what the UN asked me to work on. And it really has to do with finding companies around the world that are publicly traded. There's actually a public company and a private enterprise aspect to it. But the first piece is the public company piece. Finding companies around the world that are implementing significant parts of the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, we're riding another wave. There's another tidal wave going on in the investment community called environmental, social, and governance investing, ESG investing. It's not exactly SDG investing. It's not exactly the same thing, but there is a huge effort in the investor community to up the game, to up the standards about what investors are willing to put up with from companies in which they're invested. And it's really worth understanding. I'm not building an ESG index. I'm building an SDG portfolio first and eventually, hopefully, an index. But I want to ride the energy, I want to ride the wave of the ESG movement because they're parallel in many ways. One of the things that has complicated this is that the UN has asked us to develop ways of looking at companies that you and I might call centers in the traditional vocabulary, and that is specifically companies that are large, that come to the game with legacy investments, legacy businesses. And I've used this example in Davos and a number of other places of the French energy company Total. How can we acknowledge in an environment that would typically mark Total out of the consideration because it's an oil company, a carbon footprint of enormous size, how can we reward them for having the second largest wind farm and the third largest solar farms in the world? In other words, they've taken part of their enormous cash flow and diverted it into renewables in a way that makes them important in the world market. So the traditional ways of green investing would knock them out. And we want to find a way to build that narrative in such a way that we're rewarding these very large companies that come to the modern times, that come to this new understanding of green, the importance of affecting climate change, for example, that come to it with these cash flows that can make a difference. It would be very easy for me to sit and find a whole lot of computer software companies that have virtually no carbon footprint and no poisoning of the environment, but I wouldn't be redirecting enormous cash flows. And I think the pragmatic approach in Geneva has been to say, let's find a way to reward the companies by drawing attention to the good they're doing in a media environment which is focused on drawing attention to the bad companies are doing. Let's find a way to reward that good and draw attention to it and encourage the movement of part of these enormous cash flows. So we started with the 500 largest companies in the world, and we're doing a lot of work. We've purchased a lot of the ESG data to look at that because there are at least 4 firms out there that are doing an honest, hard-working job of trying to identify the ESG characteristics of large numbers of companies. We have plenty of information on European companies. We have plenty of information on American companies. We don't have very good information on some of the companies from the rest of the world, and we're struggling to get that. So all of this being said, we are very optimistic of being able to identify a sensible portfolio. We've been tracking it on paper for about 2 years now. It's actually outperforming some of the major indices. I caution you to be cynical about backcasting and paper portfolios, but it's important for us to do it. And we think that we're going to be able to come out of this with a portfolio that makes a lot of sense, that will encourage these very large companies to redirect some of their cash flow into sustainable and perhaps renewable activities. And I would ask you, indeed I would beg with you, to pay attention to the SDGs and join the team that gets them to the tipping point, because it looks like the best effort I've ever seen of generating bottoms-up support at critical mass around the world.
Thank you, Al, for this complete overview. Valarie, SDGs is not new for you, right? I mean, what I learned now is that the city of Cleveland has been developing sustainable development reports for the last 10 years, right? Give us a take on the Cleveland.
Good, thank you. It's kind of hard to follow all that, but I want to say, first of all, thank you for inviting me back here again. It really is very important to be here. One, to learn, to grow, and to take best practices back to my city, the greatest city in the United States, that's Cleveland, Ohio. It's my story, I'm sticking to it. One thing that we've done, my mayor is the longest serving mayor in the history of the city of Cleveland, Mayor Frank Jackson. And so these are my words, but I'm going to say it today and make it come true. He's probably the only mayor in the United States that has had the opportunity to see a 10-year sustainable plan come to fruition. We actually started, and Richard, I think you will remember this, using the appreciative inquiry model 10 years ago to start what we call today Sustainable Cleveland. If you think about cities on the ground, sometimes we get accused of not being innovative and not having foresight. But if you think about really managing cities, we have to be innovative. We have to have the foresight. We have to be creative in how we manage the day-to-day operations. We always say, we're a corporation, we're a municipal corporation, and our bottom line is service, not profit. And you and I both know when people start complaining about the service or the lack thereof, it motivates you to move quickly. And so 10 years ago, my mayor, Frank Jackson, started a program called Sustainable Cleveland 2019. This is the 10th year. We are celebrating it this year. It's also, ironically, the 50th anniversary of the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. So most of you know when you used to hear jokes about Cleveland, it was the river burning, blah, blah, blah. And I used to say at conferences, that river hadn't caught fire since I was born. However, it's important because out of that came the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And so we had to be sustainable. So this year we're celebrating the fact that 50 years ago, by force, not by choice, our particular community had to get serious about sustainability. And over the 10-year period, each year we've had a year focused on different subject matters. We've gone to citywide recycling, one of the larger cities that have automatic and citywide recycling. We've also really started changing our landscape, the way we do business, with residential development now. And I think that it has caused us, to be honest with you, to really take a step back and look at where we're going. We were talking earlier about challenges and a lot of the grants that come out, you know, different challenges, I won't name any, and how most cities shy away from challenges because it makes us feel as if we have to compete against each other when we should be competing for providing good service. And so from a sustainable perspective, I think we've had to, you know, step into that space. Now we're at a point of what we were talking about, and that's why I'm so interested in your program with the UN. So we have a 10-year plan, it's come to fruition. Now what? Now we have to implement. And so having a program that's right here ready to go so that Cleveland can become the first city in the U.S. to be a part of that program, to have a program that's ready to go, to be honest with you, we would not have been able to even participate at this point had we not had the foresight as a community to say we have to come together. You talk about public-private partnerships. If you think about sustainability, that's what it is. You have government, philanthropic communities, corporations, residents, all coming together because we care about the environment, we care about our community, and we want to see a Cleveland that survives 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road. And so I can continue to talk about it, and I know we want to get some of the questions, but I just want to say, I think we are setting and we're leading example. We're not trying to lead other cities. We do believe that each city has to decide what's important for them. If there's some good practices out here, some things that be done that has been done that we can steal, then by all means we'll borrow them, and the same things from us. But charity begins at home, and for communities like Cleveland that survived, we were the hardest hit with the foreclosure epidemic, but we survived. You know, it was the local government and I think union pensions actually that were actually funding development to keep growth going in our communities. And while we don't think of development as a form of sustainability, it is as well. And so, again, I'm more than welcome to share more comments throughout.
Thank you very much. So let's go to Qatar. It's been a tremendous development in Qatar, in Doha, the last 10 years. Of course, there is a lot of, I would say, also incentives to do that. There is also now the World Cup coming up in 2022. I've had the pleasure myself to be many, many times in Doha in the last years, and It's very remarkable and interesting how this, I would say, gearing up with infrastructure for preparing for the World Cup is done in a very sustainable way. So maybe you could give us a little from your
absolutely.
perspective.
Good afternoon first, and thank you to the World Strategic Forum for the opportunity to offer a perspective from Qatar. I represent the Qatar America Institute, which is a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit that seeks to promote dialogue and informational exchange between Qatar and the United States. It's a great time to talk about sustainable cities for Qatar because just today it was announced the opening to the public of the redevelopment of the heart of Doha, a project called Mushairib, which will in fact have the highest concentration in the world of platinum and gold certified buildings. But I'll take a step back and to really retrace Doha, the capital city of Qatar, its emergence as a future of the city. You have to go back to the point where I was growing up there and the entire skyline consisted of one pyramid-shaped hotel in a barren landscape. I worked there and I witnessed it boom, enjoy an energy-driven economic boom that made available the resources that make Qatar today the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, and at one point made it the fastest growing economy in the world. Now, there's that, and then there's going to the fact that in under 4 years, Qatar will become the first Middle Eastern country to host the World Cup in 2022. The initial boom was driven by energy and hydrocarbon exports, but Qatar has really built sustainability into its National Vision 2030. And that vision has cascaded into a number of initiatives, beginning from hosting the 2012 Conference of Parties of the United Nations, which was an important milestone for concluding the Paris climate agreements in 2015, all the way to efforts to ensure that the World Cup in 2022 will be the first carbon neutral edition of that tournament. Now, these milestones have really acted as catalysts for sustainable management in Qatar, which includes a drive to rationalize the consumption of water and electricity by the residents of Qatar through more realistic pricing mechanisms. That campaign is known as Tarshid, which is the Arabic word for rationalization of resources. Tarshid has really succeeded in reducing harmful carbon emissions in Qatar by 5 million tons since it was launched in 2012. Going forward, legacy is indeed a central plank of much of what Qatar does. And that includes completing the infrastructure for the World Cup in 2022. In fact, the local organizing committee is called the Supreme Council for Delivery and Legacy. They are committed to the avoidance of white elephants at all costs. And therefore, the stadiums were designed and constructed with the intention of post-tournament reuse. They'll be made out of demountable shipping containers that will be donated to developing countries, along with 170,000 seats. In addition to that, from a sustainability perspective, it's the tightness, the compactness of the tournament that's really striking. The entire tournament footprint, from stadiums to precincts, will cover half the size of Greater London, the equivalent of half the size of Greater London. And that's thanks to government investment in sustainable transport infrastructure. So underway right now is the completion of the new Doha Metro, which will ferry fans from one venue to the next to prevent heavy reliance on gas and diesel-powered means of transport. So that's the catalyst for environmental sustainability in Qatar going forward. You'll find that the furthest distance between one venue and the next in World Cup 2022 will actually be 35 miles, the furthest distance apart. Compare that with 3,000 miles that fans have to travel in Russia sometimes to go from one venue to the next. I'd like to talk a little bit about, end on a note on food security, which I'm personally very passionate about, and which in Qatar that has gone hand in hand with water conservation. And I was part of the National Food and Water Security Planning, and one of the successes of that strategy was mandating to outlaw the harmful practice of aquifer depletion for agricultural use, and instead incentivizing water-efficient and energy-efficient hydroponic and greenhouse technology to grow local food and produce fruits and vegetables so that you can Qatar can protect itself from volatility in global food markets. And of course, if you're going to talk about sustainability, you have to talk about investing in human capital, and Qatar has taken that very seriously for many years. The government has dedicated 2 to 3% of its GDP every year to R&D, and has invited 7 elite American research universities to set up shop in Qatar as full degree granting campuses. You have Carnegie Mellon for robotics, Cornell Weill medicine for medical degrees, Georgetown University. I'm personally a product of that institution, graduated from Georgetown in Qatar. You have Virginia Commonwealth for design. I'm a Northwestern for media and journalism, so cherry picking the finest institutions in every major. And so Qatar is taking education, sports, and the next wave of growth will definitely come from trade and logistics with the completion of Hamad International Airport and its expansion, and the completion of Hamad Port for maritime logistics. So I hope that gives you some color and flavor on what Qatar is doing for sustainability.
Thank you very much. I mean, we're missing one speaker here today. It's Mr. González, the city manager of Miami. So I thought in replacement of him, maybe Richard, what's your Miami perspective?
Sure. You know, this is one of the 2 cities that I live in, Toronto and Miami. And several years ago, with the support of Mark Rosenberg, the president of Florida International University, my colleague Brian Shiner, who's my dean, John Stewart, who runs our Miami Beach Urban Studio, and the generosity of the Knight Foundation, we built a little project called the Miami Urban Future Initiative. You know, if you look, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to look around Miami and see the incredible boom in construction, and to see a city that is, aside probably from Toronto, the most globally, even more so than New York, and the New York metropolitan, globally international city in North America. Attracting people, obviously, because it's logistic and financial and business hub of Latin and South America, but an extraordinary amount of people from Europe and all over the world. So this city has become a case study in globalization. So yeah, we've been taking and you can go to the website, Miami Urban Future Initiative, you can see everything we've done. We've been tracking everything from Miami's rise as a global city. It's well into the top 20. Its ability to attract talent from around the world. By the way, fact, there are 2 cities in the United States where international immigrants make up an extraordinarily high share of either, if you want to measure their knowledge workers or creative class, or people with a bachelor's degree and above. One is San Jose in the heart of Silicon Valley, where those international immigrants make up 40% of those, and the other is Miami, where 40% of our creative class and 40% of our highly educated people come from other countries. Miami has become one of the, look, when I was a kid, there were no startups in Miami, none. When I started tracking startups in the 1980s, working with a group, you know, the Council on Competitiveness, where you were, we saw no startup activity. It was on the West Coast, it was a little bit around Boston. Now Miami has emerged as one of the top 10, the Knight Foundation played a big role in this, local entrepreneurs, top 10 in the United States, top 20 in the world. But Miami also is dealing with deep issues. It's a highly unequal economy. Our most recent reports have been on inequality. It really is a tale of 2 cities, where you have extraordinarily high net worth individuals and then a hospitality and tourism economy. Housing unaffordability. Miami is another example. The need to make investment in transit. And then, of course, the topic we're talking about here, sustainability. I mean, what other place, perhaps in the world, is more of a case study in sustainability, climate change, the effects of sea level rise? We're already seeing climate-based gentrification here, where wealthy real estate developers and others are buying up formerly low-income neighborhoods and getting ready to redevelop them into higher-income housing. But one thing I just want to mention, which is so fascinating, when we think about sea level rise and climate change, we always think about big cities. And the OECD reports show us, well, the cities under threat are the big cities in Asia and Miami and New York. What's really interesting, we're sitting here today in Coral Gables. There a bunch of small and medium-sized cities, all up and down the coastlines, certainly of the United States. You know, I live here in Miami Beach, that are significantly under threat, and they don't have the resources of big cities. So one of the things we've been thinking about at our Miami Urban Future Initiative, FIU and EMBUS, is actually trying to build an institution, a think tank, which could deal with the problems of sustainability, not for the world's biggest cities, but for many of these small and medium-sized cities. And I think there's probably no better place to get a handle on that than the cities that begin to get a handle on it, the cities that line the coastline around Miami and southern Florida.
No, I totally agree. I mean, also these projects that we are setting up, of course, we are not here to support really Silicon Harlem or some of the big cities. We are here to help cities in developing, emerging countries, right? It's almost nothing. I always thought there was someone taking care of this. Bad news is not. There is nobody out there. And, you know, when we have meetings in Colombia or we have thousands of people coming to our meetings and want support for, you know, it seems like there's a lot of city support out there, but it's not. And we need to be better in this match between our cities. I mean, I'm very curious to hear, how much are you cooperating with American cities together on these type of issue? Not just, because we have a lot of these concepts, sister cities, we're very good in culture, education, a lot of these things. We're not good in cooperating between cities on infrastructure, right? I mean, you told me you have a lot of sister cities in Cleveland. Are you using them for the purpose of solutions for your cities, technology, integration, financing, PPPs, these type of issues with your co-American cities?
Yeah, I think a little bit of all the above. We have 22 sister cities in the city of Cleveland. But you said something that I think is important. You know, how are we getting along on the local level? So our region, matter of fact, I chair our metropolitan planning organization this year. So it is a region of 5 counties. And so we have to work together. I think we were all in a situation years ago when funding started changing, cuts from the federal government, cuts from the state. We had to work together. Just in Cuyahoga County, you know, in our county, we have so many, 57 different municipalities and townships. And so some are small, some are large. And it really came down to so goes Cleveland, so goes the region. And so it forced us to work together. It forced us to collaborate. I will say, I believe one of the things we do very well in Cleveland is work together. We have a saying that when we work together, we collaborate together, there's no stopping us. But when we're at odds with each other, and that's when it's tricky. And today, we just can't afford to be at odds with each other. And so, yes, we are, one, working closer with each other. Two, I will tell you, with organizations like the United States Conference of Mayors and National League of Cities, I'm a former past chair of the American Public Transportation Association, we have to learn from each other. We don't like to compete per se against each other, but we want to learn from each other. We want to see what's happening. We actually want to come visit you as well. Yeah. But really to start networking and making sure that on the ground that we're really working together. We're hosting a Sister Cities Conference, the first time we're doing that this upcoming year, to really do what we're talking about. What are our sister cities doing? You know, Taipei, Taiwan, a lot of students come from Taipei, Taiwan to Cleveland State University for engineering. It's a phenomenal opportunity. And so as a community now, we're saying, how do we retain them? And then one last point, just before I left Cleveland last week, Cleveland State University just signed a program to start attracting and going out and looking to get international students within the city of Cleveland, and then provide them the proper wraparound services so that they are successful. And it aligns with the Say Yes program that we just announced in Cleveland as well. So through education, through networking, and peer-to-peer, we do collaborate because we find that we're the most successful when we work together.
I think this is the most important area that we have to build in terms of international institutions. I've worked a bit with the UN. I do a lot of work with the Inter-American Development Bank. But we do not have the infrastructure for cities to learn and to train. I think we can give the C40 a lot of credit. We can give Mike Bloomberg and the Bloomberg Philanthropies a lot of credit for the Mayor's School. One of the things that I've been very passionate about, and I've one candidate, the previous panel was very fascinating, talking about education. If you look at the birth of modern medicine, Johns Hopkins University took up the mantle 100 years ago of creating science-based, laboratory to bedside, linking clinical practice to science. Engineering institutions like MIT took this up 150 years ago. We have management schools all over the world. If you want to be a doctor, you have to go to one of 600 and so teaching hospitals. We have virtually no infrastructure to train city leadership. So at the University of Toronto, somehow, I convinced the president of the University of Toronto that we should launch the world's first school of cities. I was telling Alfred, I was just up at MIT meeting with the provost, who's an old friend, saying MIT should do the same. We need a massive effort in not only the United States, but in the world, of creating a training-based, science-driven infrastructure. We just believe that cities should somehow just wing it. You know, we have all of these massive problems. Mayors should somehow come up with a solution, you know, go meet with another mayor. But when you think about the kind of capacity building, and you're doing it, I mean, you're doing it, the capacity we have to do, and maybe that's something, a great thing for Qatar. You know, I taught at Carnegie Mellon for 20 years. Maybe Qatar could set up in the Middle East. What would a school of cities and city building really look like? What are the disciplines from computer science to public health to medicine to land use planning and architecture and more, sea level rise and climate change that we would need to do? But I think this is the most serious problem facing the world today, bar none.
I totally agree. And of course I need to agree because I'm working for the UN and with these programs. But what is the UN? I mean, it's all the member states is part of the UN, right? That's what it is. It's a tremendous institution. It's in every country in the world. I don't know if you know it, but in every developing country, we have an investment office. From UNIDA, for example. Is this investment in information given to the private sector or for you investors who are interested in knowing the context? No, it's silos. It's two different worlds. And what we're trying here now and setting up the project, we said we're not going to even touch a city without we having strong private sector partners with us wherever we go. And we're going to make this data that the UN has available for the private sector, for the investment. You don't need to look for it. We're going to give it to you. And then you're going to help us. And I think that's the tremendous, I think we are a neutral partner. The United Nations doesn't have a stake in here. We wouldn't go politically into Cleveland and saying doing this or doing that. No, we can do it in a neutral base. And I see that in a lot of cities, this is really what's been missing. Because it's so much politics, it's so much back and forward, and now you can come in here and just look at the issues. And what we do is also, you look at the standard that we're doing now, we're looking to the cities then with the top priorities. Top 10 priorities of projects that we can handheld and help you to get finance, help you to get the right technology to fit in, instead of having one-on-one companies knocking on the door. So I think the whole context of capacity building, leadership, bringing this together, that should institutions do like the United Nations. But there's also other, of course, international organizations doing tremendous work out there. If you engage the Red Cross, you're covering the whole thing. So I think, Alfred, do you agree with me?
You know,
I hope.
I think it's worth pointing out that this focus on cities is probably the only layer that we can really pull this off at. Clearly, the federal governments around the world it's just too abstract. I was a policy wonk on the National Infrastructure Advisory Council. It was sort of the friction layer between talking about things and getting stuff done. But the city is better than the state, at least in the United States, because it's where the action happens. And I don't think we can emphasize that too much here to reframe our thinking and say cities are where the action has to be. You know, Kari, I think the electric buses issue is a really interesting one. It's an easy way to save an awful lot of carbon, and yet it's a pretty big front-end cost. So where is the financing mechanism to get, pick a number, 50,000 electric buses? That's a lot of money. Right now we've got UN Ops bringing some money to the table, but we've got to get out into get an acceptable financial instrument to deal with upgrading traditional buses, because you don't want to throw all that capital out when you just need to change the drivetrain and the storage mechanism for the energy. So I just want to hit everybody right square in the face with the idea, think about it at the city level where you might actually be able to get it done.
I mean, we need to think big. Really, we are talking about here a solar panel here and 3 buses here. And we approached, this is what Alfred is referring to, we approached an insurance company and said, can you help us? We need buses in X city, 500 electrobuses. And they said, no, you want 5,000? Then we can look into an investment model. So of course now we have thousands of cities in this program. Makes sense. For all of this technology, they need the same thing. Cleveland, you need it, you know, Miami needs it. Why don't we bundle it together and get it done? That's it.
And I'd just like to add a note about PPPs because everyone talks about it as the sustainable way of financing large capex, and just that Qatar isn't a new entry into this model. Its entire oil and gas industry was built on a PPP model, joint ventures with oil majors like Exxon that came and brought the know-how, and they had skin in the game. They put their own money into the industry and made Qatar what it is today, where it dominates 30% of all exports in this commodity. And it's doing it again today, whether it's building schools, hospitals, stadiums, and the manufacture of water, which we don't think about. It's the most precious commodity. And for a country like Qatar, there's no way but to find efficient ways of financing desalination plants. And just recently, the government announced the launch of a new $4 billion desalination plant in Halul, which is a joint venture with a number of Japanese and American companies. They have a joint ownership structure, and the production and distribution of water will be done through a PPP model. So that reduces pressure on the government's budget, and it creates returns for private sector in Qatar and internationally.
Yeah, I think all rich country has a responsibility to act responsible, right, and be an example. And it's also interesting with the issue here, because I get it very often. Norway, as you probably know, is very high on electromobility. I think we are number 3 in the world in terms of population to electromobility. I read yesterday that every 8 out of 10 cars in Oslo is electro cars. So 8 out of 10. This is not happening in Munich, say to so. Maybe it's also not the best, I would say, in Munich to do that. But you know, and we are, oil and gas country like Qatar. You know, there's just issues and business models and technology integration that needs to be as an example for other countries to follow.
I was just going to say, just as a point of sustainability, when I chaired American Public Transportation Association, and each year when we go for our funding, so many years for our funding for the federal government, what do we go after? We go after a gas tax. We want to increase the gas tax, and we want to index it for so many years. And we had a speaker speak to us, and he said, you're the American Public Transportation Association. You're leading the nation in policy around public transportation, but you're sitting up here and you're ready to go lobby Congress for what? A gas tax. What are you going to do when all the vehicles are electric? How are you going to fund yourself? And so as you talk about sustainability, it's more than that. It's how do we sustain our future as well? And you're talking about electric buses. That is the way of the future. We went from diesel to clean gas, and now we're into electricity. So we have to work together.
It's coming no matter what, right? We have 50 seconds.
Let me go in a slightly different direction. It's going to sound really boring. But one of the things that we need is a standard vocabulary for measuring progress. And I would suggest to you that bite-sized little chunks are possible, so things you can get done. In the United States, we've just completed a taxonomy in a structured language called Extensible Business Reporting Language that fits into the SEC's vocabulary, their taxonomy for public reporting companies, and is spreading to it enables people to keep track of the production of renewable power. That's one little bite.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all my panelists here. I want a special thank to State of Qatar for hosting this session. And if you have any questions, we will be around here, so we're happy to talk to you. Thank you.